shown in the picture was opened. So in 1980, when the country gained independence, that's when the Queen Victoria Museum was changed to Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences. So as a Museum of Human Sciences, it means it has the mandate to keep objects that are of either ethnography, anthropology, or archaeological background, and these objects are used to study a people's culture or identity. And therefore, my coming to rethink about their materiality is because I was interrogating the objects beyond their aesthetic appeal, their physical appearance. I was trying to interrogate what narratives that are embedded by the original people who created these objects. So the problem statement. The objects at Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences needed a rethought because the Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences continues to operate within the frameworks that were shaped by colonial collecting practices and epistemologies, while sidelining the voices and the experiences of the communities these objects were represented. And the kind of these frameworks that I'm referring to is that the NMMZ Act that I've just mentioned, and also the collections policy that was created using the views of the Westerners or the colonial settlers during that time. And you don't find any narratives or any suggestions that were brought in by indigenous people. So early acquisition and display strategies privileged a European scientific curiosity, categorized objects through Western classifications, and stripped them of their social and ritual context. Some collections, even up to now, they still have colonial labels, and they lacked meaningful provenance and living cultural interpretations. Thus, a rethinking materiality of these objects at Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences, whilst collaboratively prioritizing indigenous narratives through participatory methods, can evolve the practice at Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences from a colonial archive into a genuinely multifocal site of heritage and identity. So the objectives. My main objectives was to interrogate decolonial curatorial approaches that are reshaping knowledge production at Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences. Specific objectives. Number one, it was to investigate the colonial museum practice on the ordering of knowledge and ethnographic objects at the Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences. Secondly, I was assessing indigenous narratives, proverbs, songs, dances, interwoven within the meanings of ethnographic objects in reshaping knowledge production at Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences. And thirdly, I was analyzing forms of collaborative engagement at Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences between the curators and the indigenous originating communities as strategies for reshaping knowledge. For the theoretical frameworks, I was using Decoloniality by Minolo and Walsh 2018. And also I used the Critical Museology by Bennett 2017. And the concept of the devil is in the details, museum displays and the creation of knowledge by Musa 2010. So for decoloniality is simply a critical approach, a movement where the colonized societies must detach from colonial matrix of power and engage in continuing confrontation of Western European supremacy and the suppression of the propaganda of a Western system of knowledge. It is a conscious rejection of Western-centric categories of knowledge, theories, or methodologies to epistemic liberation. Thus, it's an understanding that European modes of thinking are not universal. So in museum practice, decoloniality is it's a critical process of dismantling the colonial power structures, biases, and knowledge systems historically embedded within museum spaces. So decoloniality is like in the museum practice, it is an ongoing commitment to undoing the systematic marginalization that was created by coloniality. And the reason why I chose decoloniality is because Walsh and Minolo kind of indicate that there's need for one to actually understand what decoloniality really mean in theory and in praxis, as in theory and in practice. So there is need, they indicated that there is need for one to ask crucial questions like what is it that you are interrogating, with whom, for what, and for what reason, to be for what reason, for the decoloniality uh, uh, movement to be functional. Secondly, the critical museology is simply an audience-centered approach, which is kind of different from the traditional museum practice, which was mostly object-centered. So it is an inquiry from broader perspectives, practice self-reflection, while it's questioning the narratives presented and also exploring alternative interpretations. It is culturally responsive, valuing of equity, inclusion, access, and social justice to explore political, social, cultural, and expansive thought within museums. It encourages new exhibitions that tell untold stories, rearticulating knowledge, rearticulating knowledge systems for public dissemination, reimagining organizational and management structures, and repurposing museums in line with the multicultural communities. So for the aspect of the devil is in the detail, Musa mentioned that there is a complex network of attributes considered when assessing the epistemological function of a museum. There is need to reflect, or there's a reflection of the power of museum displays in communicating knowledge. And the devilish details includes one, to interrogate whether a display is historic or contemporary. How do the objects create meaning? How do displays create new worlds for objects to inhabit? And how does this connect and create a system of meaning relating to the subject being presented? Significance of the study. So I was doing mostly provenance research, and I was attempting a confrontation of Eurocentric perspectives and challenged colonial legacies and power structures, probably due to the way I was looking at how curatorial work is done and trying to emphasize that it is not only the curator, the museum curator, who have the knowledge or the sole knowledge about objects. It was also access to cultural heritage, the reconstruction of memory and meaning of objects, offering a counter narrative to dominant Eurocentric historical accounts. Indigenous collaborative knowledge production was about deconstructing the colonial biases and see how the museum is kind of trying to move away from the colonial biases that influences the practice even today, years after after the country has gained independence. So I was looking at the Zimbabwe Museum of Humane Sciences as an empirical example and a platform for dialogue about recontextualizing objects for new interpretations, that's moving from the aesthetic, the physical aspects of an object, trying to extract the intangible. For methodology, I used ethnographic research design using a qualitative research approach. This was useful because I immersed myself into the culture of Zimbabwe Museum of Humane Sciences for a very long time. Actually, ethnographic research takes a very long time because you need to understand and learn the characters, the attributes, and all the other surrounding environment of how these people were working at Zimbabwe Museum of Humane Sciences. So I started my data collection somewhere around January 2023 up until January 2024 because I needed a long time to understand their practice and to understand their culture of practice. At the same time, so my study population, I managed to use information that I collected from 42 participants. I was using purposive sampling and I collected information from 13 employees at Zimbabwe Museum of Humane Sciences, which include the director, the chief curator, one retiree, and the curatorial staff in the ethnography department. For originating communities, I traveled from Harare, as shown in the map here, where the Zimbabwe Museum of Humane Sciences is located. I had to travel to go to southeast Zimbabwe, in Chipinge area, where the Ndau are located. And I had to interrogate one village here in the Jersey area, Chipinge North, and I also went to Checheche village, Chipinge South. So for the first village I collected data from 18 participants, and these participants also included a group of traditional dancers of Muchongo traditional dance. And in the Checheche village, I had conversations with 8 people. The reason why I had to choose the Ndao people is because I had first selected objects from the Ndao out of all the other objects that I have seen, simply because there are indications that the Ndao are always marginalized in the country. And there are indications that they have rich and cultural heritage, but it has been underdocumented. So that's the reason why I chose to interrogate objects that were collected from the Ndao. So from there, I also went on to get information to inquire about a cultural heritage, a sacred site here, which is called the Narira Hills, which is co-managed between the Zimbabwe Museum of Humane Sciences and the custodians of this site. So out of the people I was talking to, and since I was using purposive sampling, the information I found useful to my study, I extracted from about 3 people. And then the type of the objects that I examined, I examined snuff containers, ceremonial clay pots, and the traditional dance. And these were the objects that were indicated in the museum to have been collected from the Ndao people. So that's the reason why I chose to go to the Ndao area, which is in the shaded part here. So for data collection methods, I was being informed by indigenous and collaborative curation. For indigenous curation, that's why I had to choose unstructured interviews, because I didn't want my participants to feel like I had come to them to extract information from them, but I wanted them to feel like they were participants, they were like equal participants, so they could ask me any question. The unstructured interviews were not kind of like already structured. I didn't really kind of like have a way to start asking questions. So it was more of like a conversation, a dialogue, whereby they themselves could ask me questions and I could also respond to them. And also I could ask them questions, making them feel comfortable to tell their story and feel like they were part of the research than making them feel like they were just subjects. So I also went on to use exhibition analysis and then participant observations at Zimbabwe Museum of Humane Sciences. I took part in meetings, in ongoing activities in the storage places, just observing how people were conserving or were discussing or were trying to extract information which they were using in the data, in the documentation processes. I was trying to find out who had the final say. Does everyone's observation or views evaluated, either a student or an intern or the lowest person in the curatorial practice or the highest person in the curatorial practice? Who has the final say? That's what I was trying to observe. And for archival records, I also managed to find out what kind of information that was incorporated during the time these objects were acquisitioned. So I went on to use a narrative data analysis technique, where I was like, from the unstructured interview, I was treating the whole conversation as data, whether the content or the narrative or simply the body language or everything, all was part of my data. So I was able to analyze what kind of features, what kind of actions these people were doing that would have informed my findings. The key findings, and according to the first objective, the colonial museum practices on the ordering of knowledge about ethnographic objects at Zimbabwe Museum of Humane Sciences. So this objective informs my chapter 4, and I found out that there's evidence of unethical collecting practices, treasure hunting, and looting. There's also a way of persuasion or coercion where people were forced to bring their objects into museum spaces. There were also objects that were collected as a result of military conquest and scientific expeditions. And the picture here is just a statement that I found at the entrance of the storage room, which is indicating that the Witchcraft Suppression Act ordered people to bring in or ordered that objects which were kind of like suspected to be used for sorcery or magic, any kind of magic, were taken into museum spaces. So this Witchcraft Suppression Act was a legal instrument, legal in courts, that was designed to kind of persuade people to bring in their objects so that they'll stop practicing whatever they were practicing, which was regarded to be not proper by the Europeans. I also find out that the Colonial Museum practice of ordering knowledge at the Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences was kind of, or had already decontextualized objects to satisfy European scientific curiosity. For example, the Mkwati walking stick. So this walking stick was taken by force from Mkwati, who was a messenger of God, and there's a belief that he was used by God, and he influenced the first uprising of Ndebele against the colonial officials. And then there are indications, or it was stated that this walking stick was used by Mukwati to make him invisible. It had magical powers to hide him from the colonialists, while he was influencing the people to rise against the colonialists. But then later on, he was ordered to be killed, and the instrument was collected by Baden Powell, who was a colonial official, the founder of Boy Scouts in the country. And it stated that he took this object and stayed with it in his collection up to 100 years until the object was returned back to the country. So, continuing with my first objective, I realized that I found out that the acquisition records omitted indigenous provenance. As you can see on the registration card here, the kind of information that was recorded by an object was simply, it was given an entry number. They also recorded the ethnic group where the object was taken from and the provenance, particularly a place where the object was taken from, the country, the name of the object, and the material. The dimension is not recorded, surface decorations, they are not recorded, and the donor who is regarded to have donated the object to the museum, the name indicated that definitely the person is not an indigenous person, which kind of showing that, but you can see that nothing is written about the object's creation, the way the object was created, or the maker of the object, but rather it seems like the person who donated the object is the one who is being celebrated, and that's why they are recorded here. And in this way, it's showing that a lot was discarded right from the onset when the object was created or how it was used, but only started from the person who donated the object to the museum space. So, for my second objective, I was looking at the narratives that were embedded in the ethnographic objects. And the first picture here is showing a display about snuff containers. And then if you see this object, this display is just containers with a label, maybe snuff containers. That's all, and that's the end of it. There is no any information about the use and the context in which these objects were used. And then in the Ndau, at Chipinge, when I was having conversations with Ndau, I came across this traditional healer in the picture here. And she explained to me what the snuff containers, how she uses the snuff container she is holding in her hand. She talked about how the snuff, what I gathered is it's not the snuff container that is important, but it's the sniffing of that snuff and how it connects him to the spiritual world as the person kind of inquires about a person's problem, someone who would have come to inquire about something. And then what the information that she gives, the whole process is what is important. And it seems to indicate that when there's no staff, this snuff, she cannot connect with the spiritual world. And this kind of narratives one cannot find when only viewing these objects in the museum space at Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences until they have a conversation with the Nganga, the traditional healer who actually using the objects. So in this case, I was able to reclaim true identities of these objects and to re-establish a living connection of how the objects used in connection to the people who uses the object and their function. Also still on objective number 2, the embedded indigenous narratives, I also explored the ceremonial clay pots, and the first picture here is the clay pot in the storage spaces in the museum, and then this one here is in the exhibition. And then in Chipinge, the second village that I traveled to in Checheche, I found these ladies making beer. And this beer was meant for a celebration of, they were preparing for welcoming a new bride into the family as the elderly son of the family had gotten married. So this beer was supposed to be ready in 2 weeks as they were preparing to welcome the new Mwenga, the new Murora, who they call a daughter-in-law who was coming to join the family. So this way, the way I interrogated this object from how the clay pots were made, who had the right to make these clay pots, usually the elderly women, and who had the right to prepare the most delicious, tasty beer, who are the elderly women past their menopause, or who had reached the menopause stage. And it was indicated also that if someone who has not reached menopause, or if someone managed to get in contact with this beer processing while it's on their periods, it made the beer to turn sour. So I was able to kind of my finding was like this interrogation was restoring the significance of the ceremonial clay pots. And lastly, on second objective about the embedded narratives, I also looked at these traditional skirts attires that were used in the traditional dance, Muchongoyo traditional dance. And after this picture is indicating the objects as they are in the Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences. But after talking to the people who are using the objects in the Ndau space, one cannot understand who actually wears what and what meaning do the objects have. What even made one to make such a skirt in the first place until you speak to the people who use these objects. So the kind of narratives that I found were like re-evaluating the narratives and in a way kind of fosters the indigenous people's identity. So it was kind of indicating or refostering the Ndau people's narratives, informing what these objects were really about, not just the colonial interpretations. And as you can see here, the people are dancing, wearing the object are kind of like bringing in the actual use for one to understand something one cannot just find out when you find these objects lying here in the museum storage space. For my last objective, I was analyzing the collaborative engagements that the museum have with the communities. So I found out that there was kind of a co-curatorship that was happening between the Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences curators, where they engaged Mbira. So the instrument here is a traditional Mbira instrument that was played during the traditional time for people to come and socialize while it's at the same time communicating and interacting with their ancestors. So the kind of co-curation that I got is because it's through one curator who told me that they were enhancing their Mbira instrument documents when they engaged in conversations with Mbira player, teacher, and maker, Sekuru Chigamba. And these kind of conversations kind of influenced the Mbira to be identified as a unique object that was taken from Zimbabwe, and it was identified by UNESCO in 2021 and added to the list of instruments, cultural instruments, that are original to the country. I also realized that the other kind of collaborative engagements was about the co-management. So co-management of sites and shared authority. So for the Narira Sacred Hills, which I indicated earlier, of the spaces which I was looking on, which kind of like share authority with the Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences. So Narira Sacred Hills is a sacred place where the Nyamweda people reside, the Nyamweda spirits reside, but then it is regarded to be a spiritual monument under the management of Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences. But the Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences had to conjoin to co-manage the site together with the indigenous custodians of this space. And actually, if you get to Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences and you intend to visit that site, the curators will just take you to the site. But upon reaching the site, they give one of the custodians the mandate to tell you or to tour guide you around this space, which is kind of a co-management of the site and also an understanding that we can share authority and knowledge production, either is indigenous knowledge practice or the curator or scientific obtained knowledge. So this kind of co-management is also one of the engagements that I found in between the Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences and the communities. Another form of engagement is allowing the ritual access and negotiated stewardship. For example, that Mukwati walking stick, which I mentioned earlier, that it was taken by Baden after Mukwati was killed. So this object later on was repatriated from Europe after a period of about 100 years. So the article here is showing how the object came back from Europe and was repossessed at Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences. The person here is the chief curator who is holding the object the time it came back. And actually, the descendants of Mukwati are believed or they are given access to come and use these objects if ever they have any ritual or any inquiries that they need to do with their ancestral spirits. So they come, they inform the museum curators, they are given the money, they are given time to interact with the object. If they have anything, any issues they want to share, with the belief that whatever they'll be saying is going to the Mukwati himself, they are given that opportunity in the museum space. So it was kind of like an engagement that the Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences is doing, that of giving access to rituals and a negotiation of stewardship. So the object it could be like in the custodianship of Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences, but it's still allowing the communities to come and use the object, something which was not the case during the colonial practices. So for discussion, as I was looking at the colonial and decolonial strategies at the Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences, I realized that the rethinking of knowledge production at Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences is an ongoing commitment. Curators need to always reflect on their practice. Unlike colonial officials, they should consider highlighting shared values and curate displays that showcase the shared human values and foster understanding and connectedness. So I kind of asserted or advocating for a concept of wunu in curation. Wunu simply mean humanness or being humble. And then I'm trying to assert the notion of curatorial humanity, where I'm personifying the practice itself. I'm not in a way or in any way saying the curators at Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences lacks wunu. No. I'm saying the practice itself at Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences need to be embedded in wunu, a practice that respects that respects a people's perspectives about their own objects. The Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences has to initiate dialogues and address past difficult histories. Curators need to be humble and they need to be open to criticism and understanding that they are not all knowing. They are not the ones who have the sole knowledge about objects, and understanding that they can also accept other systems of knowledge. So the aspect for other perspectives too, it is one aspect for other perspective to museum practices. In conclusion, the study challenged the underlying assumptions, biases, and political implications through which the Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences was created on. The long-established views of taking a museum as a neutral space of knowledge creation, and dissemination was interrogated. Looking at the Ndau communities, their participation offered a varied experience of suitable information that can be used in museum education, enjoyment, or knowledge sharing, as noted in the revised museum definition that I mentioned earlier on. So there were indications that the Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences has the power to define or confine knowledge, to remember or forget histories, evidenced by a rich source of information by the Ndau embedded in the stored objects. But this can only be achieved by museum curators agreeing to take an initiative, not just in their museum spaces, but stepping out of the museum and accept diverse knowledge as equal knowledge too, that is meaningful to the objects that they are keeping. For recommendations, I'm looking at there's need for ongoing revisions of the collections policy so that a lot of narratives can be included in the museum spaces, particularly on labels and the narratives that were misleading, and then try to include the actual and the original meanings of the objects. And it's going to be an ongoing process because there are a lot of the objects in the museum, not just from the Ndau people, but other dialects of the Shona too, who are indigenous people to Zimbabwe. So there's also an encouragement to inclusion in dialogue with more indigenous communities. There's need to abide with ethical considerations of valuing people as with their cultural objects rather than coming to impose knowledge which they know already, or which what they know is more important and more meaningful than what curators have. There's need for sharing authority and knowledge in exhibition development, promoting staff development, engaging in projects that support indigenous people. From this work, I have publications that are under review, one of which is a book chapter which is entitled Deconstructing Systems of Biases at Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences, and to be in a book, Decolonizing Museologies of Africa, edited by Alexander Bonia. I also have a paper reimagining the materiality of spiritual objects, contemporary meaning making at the Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences and Human Sciences, at the Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences and Uganda National Museums. This is under review in the Museum and Society Journal. And I also have a provenance research perspective from the Global South and North, a paper that I also wrote about my provenance research experiences, which I was kind of equating from the Global South and what provenance research is like in the Northern Hemisphere. And this is going to be published in the Museum International Journal by International Council of Museums. I'm so grateful and would like to thank God for taking me this far. I also want to thank my supervisors for all the insightful comments they've been giving me throughout the whole process. I also like to thank the doctoral committee, the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at large, the Geda Henkel Stiftung project coordinators, my family, and everyone here for your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. I think that you managed time well. I hope you have a bottle of water nearby.
Yes.
Okay, so it's now that time when you get to engage with a critical reader. And so without wasting time, it's my honor to invite Dr. Alexander Isiko to engage with the candidate. I think we have a mic here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pamela, the Dean, and everybody around. I would like to express my gratitude for identifying me to come and interact with Patricia about her work. First of all, I would like to congratulate Patricia for reaching this far. I would like also to congratulate the supervisors of Patricia, Associate Professor Elizabeth Chazuke and Dr. Taylor for guiding and mentoring the candidate. Thank you very much. I have had the opportunity to read Patricia's work, and I would like to thank Patricia for producing such, I would like to call it a very good thesis. She has candidly put down her arguments based on her three objectives. She was able, actually, my reading of the work shows that she was immersed in the study, and especially with her respondents. I like the way she dances along with her respondents. And when you look at her work, it is really a testimony that she did a very good work. She produced a very organic thesis. I would call it organic. Patricia's voice in the thesis is very clear in both the way she interacts with her respondents, but also the way she interacts with existent scholarship in the subject area. So the study is very scholarly, yet activistic, as most decoloniality works are. And the thesis provides a fresh examination of knowledge production in the context of Zimbabwe's museum sector, centering on objects originating communities in curatorial processes. I found the thesis that it espouses strong methodological grounding. The use of ethnographic research design enabled the candidate to immerse herself in the lives of the researched, especially with the dominant figures in the Ndau communities, including Sekulu Chigamba. She also exploited her positionality as an insider to extract empirical information, which would not have been the case with the use of other methodological approaches. Indeed, the candidate's interaction with the key figures of the Ndau indigenous group in reimagining museum practices was in itself a co-production of this very thesis. The way the candidate triangulated the archival records analysis, exhibition analysis, with unstructured interviews and participant observation through engagement with communities and object biography processes is in itself an attempt at decolonizing the academic norms in research. The triangulation of data sources strengthened the validity by ensuring that interpretations of museum objects are grounded both in historical records and in the lived cultural knowledge of the originating communities. The candidate, Patricia, demonstrates strong field engagement and familiarity with the museum institution. Empirical evidence from the indigenous communities of the Ndau and wider Shona group, as well as narratives from the Zimbabwe Museum of Health Sciences staff, Human Sciences staff, provide an enviable first-hand experience of the candidate with the study subject. The candidate's personal engagement with the ethnographic collections at the museum and the replicas in the communities enhances the breadth and depth of the thesis findings. So Patricia, this is commendable work which you have produced. Nonetheless, there are a few issues that I would like to raise, not for purposes of downplaying the enormous work that you have done, but for the sole purpose of making your work more clearer to the audience. My discussion, Patricia, with you will revolve around the issues of conceptual and methodological questions, conceptual and theoretical, then methodological issues. Then we shall move into the other three chapters in which you present and discuss your findings, and then a conclusion. So our discussion is going to be around those four issues. Patricia, you carefully crafted a very attractive title. Very attractive. Rethinking Knowledge Production in Materiality at the Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences. What do you mean by the phrase rethinking knowledge? What were you thinking to come up with the phrase of rethinking knowledge, especially in the context of your study?
Okay, thank you very much for that question. In view of this, I was trying to interrogate the notion that museums are kind of regarded as a place of knowledge creation. Actually, I've realized over time that not everyone takes a museum as a site of knowledge production in any case, but most people views museum probably as just a building with objects placed there, objects of historical value or spiritual value, where people can just come and see and say, okay, so this happened in the past, this object was used in the past and all that. But the fact that the museum itself has the power to give someone or to have someone, to make someone have questions about an object that the museum is presenting. The interrogation that someone ended up having of trying to find out what really influenced the curator or anyone to put such kind of an object in a display. There is need to understand that museum itself is not just a building, but they are platforms which were created probably for knowledge creation, but this issue is about that knowledge was kind of imposed from the colonial officials or colonial narratives. But that doesn't dispute the fact that keeping on presenting our objects or keeping on presenting objects, it makes people to come to the museum to want to learn, to inquire something. And they even have people whom they can even ask questions. So these kind of questions can be something that they add to their knowledge, or something that they agree with or they don't agree with. Some people can come to the museum expecting to find some information which they may find or may fail to find. But the fact that it is used as a site to inquire something, it's a place that is regarded, a place to find knowledge. So rethinking knowledge production, I'm just kind of indicating that yes, knowledge is there in the museum space. Knowledge is there at Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences, but something is wrong because that knowledge was only produced from one side, the people who even store those objects, or the people who had their influence, their own narratives, one-sided narratives, whilst they are disregarding these narratives of the people who created, used those objects. So it is only proper to kind of include these marginalized objects, these marginalized narratives, sorry. The marginalized narratives are the most important because they are truthful meanings of the objects, rather than someone coming from the Western world and impose what they think the object is about based on only the physical or the aesthetics. But there's need to actually interrogate and understand the meaning of the objects from the people who created or used the objects. So I was trying to kind of like, I was admitting, yes, there's knowledge in museum spaces, but something is wrong with this knowledge, and therefore it needs a reimagination, rethinking.
Okay. So you usually, throughout the thesis, use two terms. You use the concept of decoloniality, but you also use the concept of decolonization. You ably discussed the concept of decoloniality, but it took it for granted and forgot about analyzing the concept of decolonization. Could you clarify how you distinguish between decolonization and decoloniality, especially in the context of your study subject?
Well, for me, actually, at some point, I would also get confused sometimes, depending with a particular scholar that I would have read at a particular time. Because for some scholars, it appears like it's just one thing that is being used interchangeably. But my own understanding after like reading several works on decolonization, I think I came to an understanding that decolonization is more of a process that can be used to detangle from these colonial matrices of power. Whilst decoloniality, particularly in museum spaces, is more of understanding or involves the need to re-examine, reconstruct, deconstruct, and reconstruct the ways in which museum spaces were created, the collections, the presentation, the research, who has the right to say something and who has the right to give authority about putting a certain object in a museum space. So for me, I would say decoloniality is more of a process just in narration, as opposed to decoloniality talking more about the practice of doing the work itself.
So which of the two was central to your work? Decoloniality or decolonization?
Well, I would say decoloniality, but I wouldn't want to dispute the fact that maybe I was caught somehow unaware when I'm using both words like interchangeably.
You also severally in your thesis use the concept of Western knowledge. You also use indigenous knowledge. Sometimes you write indigenous knowledge systems. Western knowledge systems. How do you distinguish conceptually between Western knowledge systems and indigenous knowledge systems?
Okay. I would say the Western knowledge systems are the ones which came with maybe this classification of knowledge where you are told, no, this object is archaeological, this object is of anthropological background, this knowledge, this object is about, it's an ethnographic object, this one is an object that falls in mammalogy, zoology, these kind of disciplines, they were kind of imposed by Western ways of knowing, as if to indicate that the action within objects are a cause of natural effect. But in the indigenous knowledge system, you can actually realize that it's because of human action that we have an object, and an object is meaningful. You can't just come and say this is anthropological, this is ethnography. What is it that is embedded within that object that makes you to understand that it is actually an ethnographic object, an archaeological, or simply anthropology?
Okay. He also used the concept of materiality, You actually foreground materiality as central to knowledge production. Could you explain what you mean by materiality in this context? Is it the physicality of objects, their symbolic meanings, or their social lives?
Okay. I would say materiality actually is a mix of all the list that you have mentioned. It starts from the physical, the aesthetics, that someone can see that, okay, this is a snap container. It is made of horn. It is designed with brass wires and all that. But in the same scenario, this kind of object was not just meant for any kind of person. So that's now the intangible. Maybe it was for a prince, it was used by a king. There's some kind of embedded intangible narratives that kind of give you an understanding that is what it was not just an ordinary object. So for the intangibility, or for the other perspective, which is coming from the indigenous knowledge system, it is not just the physical, but going beyond the aesthetic, that physical, and interrogate the value that was attached to the object, the spiritual attachment and the use. Because in the African context, like in the indigenous context, I came to realize that the objects were actually very, very meaningful when they are in use than when they are just placed in the museum glasses, in the museum displays at Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences. They are more meaningful when they are in use, and you can get to understand their meaning and their significance, unlike just being placed there and sepulcherized in the glass displays.
I know that in chapter 4, 5, and 6, we shall be looking at some of the most interesting objects which relate to the spirituality of the endowed. But I would like you to highlight what you meant by spiritual value of the objects, spiritual values of objects, and how were you able to define and determine what you call spiritual value?
Okay. The spiritual value, I would say, for example, I would give an example of the snuff container. Looking at the exhibition space, the snuff was just connected. It was just placed there in the exhibition, whereby someone would just come and you read the label and saying, okay, it's a snuff container. But then the spiritual value, the spiritual aspects, I came to an understanding of how this object is being used in its connection, how it is used as an object that can help mediation or being used as a medium between the living and the dead. Like, for example, in the context of the traditional healer in the Ndao, where she was mentioning that until she get hold of the snuff, take the snuff out of the snuff container, sniff it up, and then understand what she was being asked to do or what she was inquiring about. So that way, the fact that the snuff has a connection to the spiritual world, where someone is now able to find information that would help the one who would have come to inquire about a certain problem, that makes it spiritual. It doesn't end where we can say the object is a, it doesn't just end where we can say the object is a, like is made of one simply and end there. But it goes beyond not just about the material that was used, but the use of the object, how the object is being used, and the connection, which makes more meaningful, which makes more meaning as compared to the object just being there in that display. And I would say the same also about the clay pots, which are regarded ceremonial. In the museum spaces, you would hear that, okay, so these are ceremonial clay pots, which were used in the, like, making traditional beer that was used for rain-making ceremonies. But when the object is there in the display, it's just ceremonial, but you don't get to the meaning of what is it that makes that object ceremonial. Until I spoke to the ladies who were preparing the beer, who indicated to me how they use the beer, maybe as a send-off to a deceased chief, the ceremony, or as ceremonies of maybe celebrating their bumper harvest. Those kind of intangible aspects are what I'm calling intangible and spiritual.
That's fine. I would like to take you to your problem statement,
Mm-hmm.
page 19 and 21. But specifically on page 19, you state in part, most ethnographic objects at this museum were collected during the colonial period for scientific purposes, devoid of their meaning. Devoid of their meaning. That's where my interest is. How did you determine or reconstruct the original meaning of these objects, given that meanings of such objects are historically contingent, dynamic, and contextual in terms of time?
Okay. Well, I think here I was referring to the way these objects were collected. Actually, no one amongst the colonial officials who collected the objects was interested on the actual meaning of the objects to the people who created the objects. So it was more of like just an ethnographic gaze. For them, it was like, okay, so this is an object that can say, maybe can tell ethnographic aspects of an object, or simply, okay, this object is so interesting because it looks scary or whatever. But then it's something they were maybe looking as being an exotic or from a primitive culture, which they labeled primitive for the indigenous people. But for them, the colonial collectors during that time, they didn't think of actually inquiring from the people who created those objects and try to understand, like, okay, what use do you use this object? And even if they would have given the explanation, they were kind of already disregarding how these objects were being used by the people who created them. So in a way, they were devoid in the sense that the actual meaning was cut off by the nature of the collections, the way they were collected into the museum spaces. That's what I was trying to say.
On page 20, still in your problem statement,
Okay.
you position the Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences as ingrained in colonial laws and policies, hence reproducing colonial practices. And I'm asking, if that's the case, why should we expect a colonial institution to be the main vehicle for decolonization.
Okay. Well, I think here I was trying to indicate that, yes, after independence, the Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences is still adhering to these colonial frameworks that were designed by the Europeans, the Westerners, in how museum practice can be practiced. But being a national museum, obviously, it's one aspect, it's one side that we can look up to when you're talking about these decolonial curatorial approaches. Is the evidence, is the site of reference that we have, that we are using, and that I'm using in this context to say, okay, after all, this museum has the mandate, it was mandated to take care and preserve ethnographic objects, not the natural history museum, not the military museum, not the museum in the southern area, which is specializing on the dry stone wall conservation, and not the museum in the eastern region, which is concentrating on the conservation of transport and antiquities of the early settlers. But the fact that this Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences has this mandate already, and it's a point of reference that I know the museum or the country is using as an ethnographic museum. So this is why I had to use it, because that's the example that is there. A national museum that is regarded to be taking care of the ethnographic objects.
I would like to take you to your methodology chapter,
Okay.
which I have already said that it is one of the chapters which I have liked so much, because of the way you interact with your respondents and the procedures that you followed. I was so much impressed by the chapter. But in part, you indicate that you had ever worked with that museum. Is that correct?
Yes, I once worked there as an intern during my undergrad.
Okay, so you seem to have been familiar with the staff there.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. You indeed explain how you were able to get permission and the processes that you went through to be accepted to conduct research there.
Mm-hmm.
But in your descriptions, I try to see that you were having challenges to disentangle your personal attachments, and possibly, I'm very sure you must have had the friends and relations during your work at the museum. How were you able to safeguard yourself from such kind of issues, which would possibly influence or interfere with the reliability of the information that you are writing in the thesis?
Okay. Yeah, true. I agree that when I went there to conduct my research, at one point I really felt like, yeah, I was really an insider somewhere, somehow. But first, I would like to indicate that during the time I worked there as an intern, honestly, all I heard during that time was more like just phrases like, "Oh, Patricia, you are in the Department of Goblins, the Department of Shikwambo, which is the ethnographic objects, a department that deals with ethnographic objects." And for me, I was like, what are people saying about this? And people would say, haven't you seen that there are goblins in your department? Haven't you seen that there are kind of scary objects that were used for witchcraft? Haven't you seen this? But to be honest, during that time, I didn't understand what it really meant until maybe I had like experiences with other museums, not even the Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences itself. During that time, I didn't even really understand or understood what really decolonial debates were about. until I visited some other museums out of Zimbabwe, even in the Western countries. That's when I came to realize that, okay, so when people are talking about decoloniality of museums, this is what they mean. But then what does this really mean for a museum? Because my understanding during this time, especially during my MA, I came to understand that, okay, people are talking about a need to decolonize museum practices. But these museums are regarded to be the ideas that came as a colonial project. So how is it even possible to decolonize a colonial idea? Until then, I was like, okay, now I find this scholarship. As I'm applying for this scholarship, I want to go back and interrogate the Zimbabwe Museum of Human Science and see. So to understand that, okay, so when people were saying I'm in the Department of Goblins, this is what they meant, because these objects were regarded to be used for sorcery or for witchcraft by the other people, not the people who created these objects. And I can tell you that,
That's enough. I would like you to
Mhm.
you were at one time an intern at the museum. I'm just following up with that question.
Okay.
You had the colleagues there whom you had interacted with before.
Mhm.
But we also know that just like any other institution,
Mhm.
the issues of politics, power dynamics. How did you navigate the power dynamics between yourself as a researcher
Mhm.
and the museum as an institution with its own history and the hierarchies therein, as well as the politics that could have been existent there?
So now this is where I was now going to. So when I came back to Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences, I would tell you for a fact that some of the people there, besides being museum practitioners, some of them didn't even understand these decolonial debates that are ongoing. They are so much rampant out there, not even within the Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences space. These people, some of them are just coming for work, they get paid and they go back to their home, which is also something that I find interesting and a bit challenging when we're talking about decolonial issues. Like, not everyone has the same concept, a same understanding of how we can go about decolonial issues. And to an extent where I was even having a conversation with someone who have like a very crucial position in the museum, I was like, so what do you think about this new museum definition? And the person was like, new museum definition? What do you mean? You mean the museum definition was changed? Meaning this kind of a person didn't even understand this. So I'm trying to say what I was looking at, and also maybe because the process that I did before starting this research, I had to go through the whole process of writing a letter, asking for permission to come and do the research. It's not like I was like, okay, because I was here before, here I am back again. I had to go through the process just like any other person who is coming to do research. But even after some of these interrogations, some of these debates that I was going through, I wouldn't want to say probably, maybe somehow, yes, I can't deny it. Maybe probably my findings were influenced by my interactions with the people before. But I strongly believed that with my use of ethnographic research design, going to the museum about 3 or 4 times a week, I kept on asking the same kind of questions, asking the same people, trying to make sure that the information that they were giving me is the same, and understanding that I came to a realization that it's not about the relations that I had with them before, but some of them also ended up having questions and trying to find out, okay, what's really is going on with the museum
Patricia,
debate. Yes.
yeah, the explanation is okay. You can stop there.
Okay.
Patricia, in your methodology, especially on page 64,
Okay.
you ventured to explore the Nalila Hills. Is that the correct pronunciation?
Narira Sacred Use, yes.
Yes. Although you talk about it later, but my interest in the hills I got in the methodology. A monument jointly managed by the museum and the indigenous people of the Nyamweda clan.
Mm-hmm.
consider the hills as a burial site also,
Yes.
well as a shrine. And they do ancestor veneration there.
Mm-hmm.
My interest is in your last paragraph on page 64.
Okay.
Right. That the Zimbabwe Museum of Health Sciences curators apply their scientifically acquired knowledge to manage this site, whilst the indigenous custodians relied on their African tradition values attached to the maintenance of the site. Because you are making a case for what you call co-production.
Mm-hmm.
Did you identify any contestations between the two custodians about knowledge production this site? I mean between those that are using the what you call scientific knowledge and indigenous knowledge in management of the site. Did you identify any bit of contestations between the two, or all was well? If yes, in what form were these contestations? And if there was nothing like contestations between the two, why do you think so? Everything seemed smooth.
Okay. So for this one, you have used the word co-curation, and actually for me, I didn't really regard it as co-curation. I regarded it as a co-management, sharing authority to manage this sacred site. So the Zimbabwe Museum of Humane Sciences is having the mandate to take care of this site. They went a step further to consider the knowledge systems or the ways of preserving the site that was done by the custodians of the site, the descendants of the site. And yes, contestations were there, which I took note of, but it wasn't really it wasn't really in between the Zimbabwe Museum of Humane Sciences and the custodians. It was between the custodians and the farm owner who was trying to extend his territory into the museum, into the sacred site, to the Narira Hills. Like the Narira Hills was kind of being included in a farm. The owner of the farm was trying to kind of like disregard all the activities that were happening there. And so there were contestations where these custodians were like, no, this is our place of worship. You can't like deny us from coming and use our own site. And there were reports previously about that farm owner losing his cattle as a result of the contestations, which is something like which is kind of like it has some unexplained causes of how he had to lose his livestock as a result of not being cooperative with the custodians. So it came as if he lost the livestock because he was having contestations with these people. And I do not know if this is the reason why the Zimbabwe Museum of Humane Sciences chose to work together with these custodians in the co-management of the site, to an extent that when you go to the Zimbabwe Museum of Humane Sciences and you intend to also visit the Narira Hills, the Zimbabwe Museum of Humane Sciences can just help you to get to the site, but upon reaching the site, they give the custodian the right to tour you around, tour guiding you, giving you information about the site. So yeah, contestations were there, but not what I know. I didn't record anything in between the museum itself and the custodians, but it was about the ownership of the land.
That's fine. What do you consider to be the major limitation of the kind of methodology and methods that you used for your study? Just one.
Okay. I would say during my proposals, I had indicated that I wanted to also use focus group discussions, particularly with the Ndau people who are part of the indigenous people of the objects that I was interrogating. But I realized that people were not so much interested in participating in focus groups because we were reaching towards presidential elections, and I realized the people didn't want to participate in groups, else the groups will be like misinterpreted as maybe political gatherings, something like that. And also maybe the reason why I chose to interrogate objects of the Ndau people, like I've mentioned, because the Ndau are kind of marginalized. Everyone laughs about the Ndau, the way they speak. They are kind of put to the periphery almost in most of the things. And there are even like scholarly views about that. But then if it wasn't about the Ndau, maybe exploring some other dialects, maybe the most standardized one, the Zezuru and the Kore Kore or the Kalanga. And I was trying to I would have loved to just see if the kind of information that I will get is the same as how the Ndau are so particular about their own identity.
Patricia, I have picked that you had planned to use focus discussion groups, but it wasn't possible. And you find that as quite a very big disadvantage in your methodology. How did that affect your findings, your failure to use focus group discussions?
Okay. I would say the information that I got through the unstructured interviews was more of one-on-one conversations. Whereas if I would have used the focus group discussions, I would have loved to hear one narrative from a specific kind of group who are agreeing on their practices, how they do a certain thing, a certain activity, be it a traditional dance activity. Are they all agreeing at the same time? But also, I was kind of able to get information which I wouldn't deny that it was going to be more or less the same, because my interaction with the people and like amongst the people, I ended up interacting or interviewing a traditional dance group. Talking to them as a group was more of not a focus group discussion, but they were just telling me how they act, how they interact as a group of traditional dancers, showcasing the traditional dance that they did, which is kind of one of the same thing, because of course it's no longer a focus group. What I'm getting could have been same kind of information, but now this is identified as a traditional dance group, different from a focus group.
Okay. This is the last question on methodology. I take note that you were so much immersed in this study, and I have repeated that many times. And being in and with the indigenous communities, the curators at the museum, and the cordial engagement you enjoyed with key figures like Mbuya Magada, the traditional healer, Sekuru Chigamba, the teacher and maker of the mbira, the instrument. And you reference these kind of personal communications and references to these community perspectives which you picked in chapters 4, 5, and 6. My issue, what method what methodological safeguards did you use to ensure reliability and avoid what I call romanticizing indigenous voices?
Okay. Well, I'm not really so sure about that one, but what I would say is, since I've already indicated that as I was using an ethnographic research design, I have had the same kind of conversations several times with the same people, such that I was trying to kind of find if the narratives that I got last week or the week before or the week earlier were going to be different. And for a period of the whole year, from 2023 to 2024, 2023 January to 2024, the curators that I talked to, curatorial assistants, they were like, Patricia, can't you finish? Why are you asking us the same kind of questions? But for them, I was trying to find out something. If the narratives that I would have found from the first time I spoke to these people was going to be different. So I felt like my methodology design, my research, my ethnographic research design, the fact that it gave me time, extensive time to keep on repeating the same kind of conversations, it's kind of kept me to understand that what I was getting, for as long as the information was not changing, it was
Okay.
really valuable.
Patricia, we go to chapter 4. And in chapter 4, you propose integrating indigenous knowledge systems as best practice in heritage management. What do you think might be the challenges in balancing indigenous epistemologies with global heritage management frameworks?
Okay. I would say, since I'm trying to deconstruct the colonial ways of museum practice, it is really crucial for museum curators to kind of try to build trust first with the communities that they are serving or the communities that they are engaging. First, probably by just acknowledging that their collecting practices before were really unethical, and being transparent that they are coming with at least a positive objective for everyone, to the advantage of everyone. So there's need to kind of like, if they say they are going to try to create knowledge that will foster identity, it has to be knowledge that is extracted or that is created ethically through ethical practices, than just coming to say, okay, me, I'm a curator and I'm going to study how you people do your things. It's not about people, how do they do things. It's about asking them, being initiative, asking them if they are free to share their knowledge systems and regard that knowledge system as expert knowledge too, not just to think that simply because you're a curator, you have the sole or the ultimate say about a narrative.
Look here. They will demand that for somebody to be a curator, you will need to have certain kind of qualifications obtained from school and universities.
Yeah.
But here, you are proposing that we can have, for example, Sekuru Chigamba. We can have Magada. No? We can have, this is what I would like to interrupt. What do you think could be the challenge of this bit of integration, especially in terms of human resource in management of heritage resources?
Okay. So I've been kind of asking myself the same kind of question as I was reaching to the conclusion, whereby I was asking myself, is decolonization of museum practice, is there a point where we can say museums have reached a dead end, like a decolonial end, where we can say, now we have museums which are not colonized? And it seemed to me that it's not really going to happen. Rather, decoloniality is just a continuous engagement where people just need to make each other understand their positionality, their willingness to participate, and actually not everyone is interested in these decolonial debates when it comes to museum practices. So it's about maybe identifying community members who are willing to just come or maybe be recorded that, okay, you know what, I'm going to record you. Your conversation about a snuff container is going to be put side by side with a container in the Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences, and people will be listening to your voice. Of course, this what you've asked kind of complicates the curatorial position, because for someone who went to school, and is being asked to went to school to obtain these curatorial approaches, who is being educated to get that qualification, and then is being told to go back and listen to the people who doesn't understand the way he acquired this same kind of knowledge. In a way, it may cause some complexities, but in the same way, our focus here is about deconstructing the colonial biases. We're trying to bring in that which was marginalized before. So for me, it will be more of the willingness of the communities to participate and the willingness of the curators to anticipate that what they have is not the sole or the ultimate knowledge, but they can also accept criticism and use other people's narratives.
Thank you, Patricia. In chapter 5, you categorize the ethnographic collections at the museum as living objects. Living objects. What form of life really exists in the snuff containers?
Okay. I would say, and I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but I would say, looking at the exhibitions, the way the snuff containers were just placed on the walls with a label, snuff containers, you would see that without someone coming to tell you about what really were they used for and the reason why they are so much valued amongst the Ndao people, you just think, okay, it's a snuff container. It was used to store snuff. And then what? That's it. You came to the museum and then you're ready to go. You just go like that. So bringing in the narratives of the indigenous people, where you are told that somehow the snuff stored in the snuff container was used amongst friends when they'll be just sniffing, and that ritual of sniffing the snuff together would kind of enhance their relationship as friends, their trust as friends. Or when this elderly man in a family is using the snuff whenever maybe a family member is embarking on a journey and they are connecting with the ancestors and say, putting a little snuff on the ground and say, oh, our ancestors in the heavens or wherever you are, see our son who is traveling to this place looking for a job. May you help him, provide him, guide him. Please help him to find a job until we meet him again. That kind of belief that the throwing of the snuff is connecting to the spiritual world is being used in a prayer that is asking for guidance, for safety, until the time they will meet again, with the belief that they will meet again all alive. It's kind of indicating that these kind of narratives are the original narratives that were actually marginalized, and incorporating them in museum practice it will be really, really useful and a way of reshaping the knowledge production on materiality.
How does that differ from what you described as the colonial gaze ascribed to the same collections?
Actually, that will be different in the sense that for colonialists, especially considering the way they kind of seized these objects, like I kind of indicated earlier on, that mostly the objects that were taken were the objects that were used by traditional healers. The reason why they had to establish the Witchcraft Suppression Act was to kind of stop the traditional healers to do their practices, which they believed they would use the same kind of practice to call on their own gods to fight against the colonialists, because the colonialists already, they knew they were enemies to these indigenous people. So they didn't know the kind of power the Mwari or the gods of the indigenous people had. So leaving the people to keep on using those snuff containers, those spiritual objects, who knows, maybe they were going to get power to rise against themselves, the colonialists. So for a colonial gaze, it was like, okay, so this is what they call the spiritual, this is what they call the snuff container. Let's find a way of taking the container out of them. And then they said, okay, now we have the Witchcraft Suppression Act. If ever you are seen performing traditional healer activities, you will be converted, you'll be convicted, you have trespassed something, you have done something wrong, and then you may be forced to be arrested to go to the jail for practicing that kind of act. So, yeah, it was a way of stopping people and a way of trying to remove the dangerous objects, the objects they regarded dangerous from the public domain.
So on page 109, where there is a photograph of Mbuya Magada.
Okay.
109,
Mm-hmm.
photograph of Mbuya Magada from Checheche
Mm-hmm.
village. That's the correct pronunciation.
Yes.
And you describe her as a traditional healer. As a traditional healer. This is not a question, but an advice possibly that you can take.
Okay.
The roles and functions that you describe about Mbuya Magada is for a specific traditional healer whom we categorize as a diviner. It would have been possibly important to use the description of a diviner
Okay.
rather than the traditional healer.
Okay.
Because what she does is that of a diviner. Traditional healer is a much larger kind of category, which includes quite a number of healers, including bone setters. Sometimes we even categorize traditional birth attendants. So it would give weight to categorize Mbuya Magada as a diviner rather than simply a traditional healer. But you can think about that. My other issue in the description of Mbuya Magada and what she does is your attempt to delineate her all the functions of snuff containers or snuffing between culture, healing, and divination. You tend to delineate as if these are distinct. And reading the pages, especially on from page 105 up to 111, you will find that in many circumstances in the African context, it is very difficult to make a distinction between what is cultural and what is spiritual. And for healing itself, it's also very difficult to tell whether what you are doing is a cultural context of healing or a spiritual context of healing. Reading those pages from 105 to 111, what is most fundamental there is the spiritual dimension of the snuff containers and the snuffing or the snuff itself. It would be strategic possibly to take, in any case, in your description of the response of the colonialists towards the burning or collection of the snuff containers and being taken to the museum was essentially, you state that was because they feared that these objects would be used against them as a form of witchcraft. They did take note, as you write, that they realized possibly that these objects contained a lot of spiritual power, and there was fear that possibly if they are left in the communities, it would work against them. So possibly using the spiritual context of this rather than the culture and having a delineation would be much safer. But I would like to ask, you put your thesis forward that the colonialists may not have known, actually did not know possibly the meaning or the value of these objects, the snuff containers, the mbira, the instrument, and mukwati, the spiritual walking stick. But at the same time, you do right that one of the major reasons why these were collected and taken to the museum elsewhere in their countries was the supposedly strong spiritual prowess that these objects possessed. And I ask, why should we continue to blame the colonialists or the collectors of the objects at the time for not putting a lot and correct information about these objects in the museum or wherever they were collected, when their reasons for collecting these museums was different from just keeping them as ethnographic collections in the museums? Because it's as if there was fear, and collecting them and keeping them would be able to downplay the spiritual prowess of the indigenous people of Ndau. What's your comment about that?
Well, I understand they had a different objective. Their aim was totally different. They couldn't value what they didn't practice or what they don't practice. But considering that now we have a platform we can use the museum, like the Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences, as a platform of dialogue to kind of bring necessary narratives that serves the contemporary communities. So it is really necessary to kind of trying to stay relevant in the changing world. Of course, we are in the post-colonial era already, but these museums still need to serve the people, the originating communities, the communities that they used to serve during that time, which were of colonial settlers, the allies, and so forth. The communities have changed, but we still need these museums, regardless of them being colonial entities. We still regard them, we need them in the country for they serve different purposes. So I think it's more of staying relevant in the changing world.
Patricia, when you were at Magada Mbuya's place,
Okay.
you were curious about the snuff container and you hoped that she would allow you touch one of them.
She couldn't. Mm-hmm.
But he denied you the opportunity to touch. And her claim that no one is allowed to touch the snuff container. But the issue is, what happens when this same object is at the museum?
Okay.
How do you reconcile the spiritual kind of ideology that Mbuya Magada attaches to the snuff container, and when this same object is in the museum, being transferred from one place to another by a professional who may not even be from the Ndau indigenous community? This person may have even studied and is a born again and has a PhD in heritage studies. How do you reconcile? Or you want to suggest that the spiritual context, the spiritual values in these objects is contextual?
Okay. I would say I generally also in the museum practice, that of the colonial or Western influenced, there is people are not allowed to touch objects the same way, but the reasons are the ones that differs. For scientific ways of preserving objects and conserving objects, people are not allowed to touch objects in a museum setup because they believe that probably your hands would be carrying some materials that may affect the material of the objects, whether it's wood, whether it's worn. But the Western beliefs is probably your hands have some impurities that may cause harm to the material object, the physical object of it. And then in the spiritual context, the indigenous context, it's about kind of disrespecting the act that the object is used for. If I'm not a traditional healer, I don't know how to connect the people to their ancestors using a snuff container. Definitely, I don't have a right to touch the object. The contamination is different depending on who is telling the story.
So you do want to agree that the spiritual aspect of these objects is contextual.
Yes.
Okay. I was so much interested in the ceremonial clay pots. On page 119, where you were engaging with the elderly women who were in the 70s and 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And you indicate in the last paragraph on that page that the elderly women who were preparing traditional beer, you use the word traditional beer, but elsewhere you simply write beer and you don't use the word traditional.
Okay.
A problem, or there were two types of, should I call them beers? There were two types of drinks being prepared, and one was beer and another was traditional. I ask that question because it relates to our context of decoloniality, because this is a term which is a contested concept. And you reproducing what you are writing, you are trying to deconstruct. Why traditional beer?
Okay. I think it might have been maybe not being consistent in my writing, but definitely the kind of beer that I was referring to throughout this whole study was kind of the traditional beer, which I'm saying the traditional in the context of that is the long established way of making beer by the indigenous communities. I don't mean this kind of beer that is produced in the factories that came with the methodologies of the Westerners or whatever. But probably the way I was mentioning this is kind of, I was supposed to just indicate, it's the same kind of beer that is known to have been produced in the traditional way, the long established way of the indigenous way of making beer, and the myths and taboos that comes along with the process.
Okay. You need to look at that concept. It's a very contested concept. Myself, I've stopped using the word traditional something, traditional beer, traditional religion. Especially if you are in the decoloniality kind of. However, you have a picture named the figure 14 on page 119.
Yes.
Yes. But you had already indicated previously that the elderly women whom you interacted with refused you to take any picture, any photograph, because they feared that these pictures might end up on social media. You also indicated that they were afraid of devaluing. The pictures would devalue the spiritual or cultural aspects that are associated with what they were doing. Do you realize that you have that photograph or picture on page 119?
Yes, I realized I have the picture. What I was trying to say here is that I really wanted to capture them holding their cooking stick, stirring the beer or whatever. Of course, I understand it was going to be kind of like acting, but it wasn't really, because when I arrived there, I didn't know I was going to find them already in the process of making their beer. So I had to ask for permission to at least capture the pots as they were on the fire. It was during the process, and actually the person who is not shown the face but is seemed to appear in the picture is actually me, not they themselves. They refused. So at least I asked for permission to just capture the clay pots alone.
That needs to be clarified.
Okay.
Otherwise, it shows a contradiction.
Okay.
I would like to take you to the regalia for the traditional dance. You stated on page 126, and the last paragraph, second last sentence, you state that thus, as the objects were collected, their sacredness was stripped away. As the objects were collected, their sacredness was stripped away, I think, by the colonialists. And the question is, what kind of sacredness was affected? Was it the attached or essentialist sacredness which disappeared? And my issue is, when an indigenous Indau visits the museum, the Zimbabwe Museum of Health Sciences, would he or she feel, or would he or she determine that the collected and preserved object is no longer sacred and therefore deny it reverence? Now there is a spiritual walking stick which was brought back, and it is in the museum.
Okay.
Yes.
I would like to say here that first, specifically with the Ndau people, the objects I interrogated, I was examining which had the Ndau origin, were specifically the snuff containers, the ceremonial clay pots, and the traditional dance regalia. Just that. For the Mbira traditional music instrument, I was just trying to showcase the kind of engagement, the collaborations that the museum was having with any other kind of indigenous people, the Shona of Shona background, because the Mbira itself is regarded to have a Shona origin. But when I was interrogating narratives about this Mbira, I was never told, or I never got information about a specific dialect where it came from. So the object having influence to rise against, you say that the objects were collected, their sacredness, you asked about their sacredness being stripped away. This was directly in connection to the Mbira instrument. And before this, I had explained how the Mbira were being used during the colonial time. People would gather, especially during nights, during evenings, where people would come, they play Mbira. The Mbira was part of their prayers they would be doing to the ancestors. And the ceremonies during when they would gather were called Mapira, which is kind of like have a connection with the instrument itself and the kind of the ritual that happened during the night, where they believe it was a prayer to their ancestors. And still for the same reason that the colonialists felt and were scared that, okay, so these people are still making connections with their spiritual world, it was probably going to make them rise against them. That's the reason why such objects were also forbidden to be played, and most of them were seized and persuaded to be dumped in the museum spaces. So the sacredness that I'm talking about here is that connection of someone believing that if I get Mbira, I start playing it, the kind of the sound that it produces is going to make me connect myself with the spiritual world. That's the sacredness that I was talking about, and the fact that the object was taken, placed in a glass display, and just be left there without no one playing it, that's the sacredness that I'm saying it was stripped away.
Patricia, this is my last question. And I note that one of your aims is to reclaim true identities of the objects. You argued the sacredness was stripped away from the objects. You also argue that the objects as they appear at the museum do not have enough information. And you argue that these objects in the museum are just there for what you call aesthetic value. And you want to reclaim the true identities of the objects. You want to reconfigure, to reconstruct, to reimagine what possibly we would call these objects during their pre-colonial stage era. But there are scholars who argue against the notion, because you seem to argue that we can reconstruct and have the original meanings and value of these objects. But there are scholars who argue against the notion of unchanging traditions. Like, of course, Ranger, Handel and Leineken, Ben Amos, Mudimbe, Mazrui, and Edward Said. They argue against the notion of unchanging traditions.
Okay.
In your case, indigenous knowledge and also traditions connected with ethnographic objects are treated, you seem to treat them as if it were stable, recoverable, and pure. How do you avoid or take care of the aspect that meanings of such objects may change, and for these objects to remain relevant in the changing dynamics and times? The way these objects are treated has to be adaptable. Without these objects adapting to the changing dynamics, to the changing times, they may lose meaning. What's what do you say about that?
Okay. I would say I agree. They might have been, obviously, there are some aspects of authenticity that would have been lost over time, because obviously communities changes. Communities are not homogeneous. And people being in a community, it might be that, for example, the snuff containers, it's only the person who value that. If I had asked someone, not the Mbuyamagada, the traditional healer or the diviner, about how she uses the context, the snuff containers, definitely if I had asked a male person who is just walking somewhere and I met him, I saw him like snuffing, probably, or most probable, the conversation or the narratives would have really been different. But at least the indigenous narratives, when you are talking to the people who know the objects, who created the object, who make use of the objects, it's close to the authenticity of the objects. And like just saying, okay, the colonialists took this, put it in the museum spaces, and this is what we have. No, there has to be a way of trying to reinvent these narratives and put something that is at least closer to the authenticity of the objects. So I'd rather believe what the person tells me, the person who is using the objects tells me, unlike someone who doesn't even understand what the objects was, who collected the objects based on assumptions. It's most likely that someone who uses it has the most authentic information about such an object.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you for knowing your stuff and thank you, Dean, for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Isiko. I think Dr. Isiko deserves a louder round of applause for engaging the student. And thank you very much, Patricia, for indeed defending your work